imagine walking into a hospital maternity ward, right? And you know that 9 out of every 10 women who walk through those exact same doors are going to be wheeled into an operating room for major abdominal surgery.
Which sounds completely wild.
Right. It sounds like some dystopian hypothetical. But that is the actual documented reality right now in the private healthcare sector of Brazil, a Caesarean section rate hovering right around 90%. And yet you look across the ocean at regions in sub-Saharan Africa, and the rate drops to this severe deficit of just 7.1%, meaning women who desperately need life-saving surgery, simply they just can't get it.
Yeah, it's a staggering imbalance. To put those extremes into perspective for you, the World Health Organization has spent, well, years studying the evidence to establish a baseline threshold. Based on actual population needs for life-saving interventions, the ideal global C-section rate should sit somewhere between 10 and 15%.
Right, 10 to 15.
Exactly. So when you have an entire regional private sector hitting 90%, or even a global average that currently sits at 21.1%, which, by the way, translates to almost 30 million procedures every single year, we are forced to confront a massive systemic failure.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are taking you into a master blueprint for safely reducing those unnecessary C-sections. We've got a slide deck synthesized from over 170 landmark studies by the Fetal Medicine Forum, and our mission is to take this absolute mountain of data and translate it into a dynamic, strategic action plan.
Because what the numbers tell us is that this facility-level variation, this wild swing from 7% to 90%, it just cannot be explained by medical case mix alone.
Right. You don't just magically get a local population where 90% of the women physiologically require surgery to give birth. That's not how biology works.
No, not at all. The drivers are almost entirely non-clinical. The data reveals this incredibly complex web of institutional, financial, and behavioral factors, and the stakes are incredibly high here. If health systems do not introduce structural, evidence-based interventions right now, that annual number of 30 million procedures is projected to hit 38 million by the year 2030.
Wow.
I mean, we are looking at a runaway train of medicalization.
So it's like a fundamentally broken global thermostat. You know, it's freezing in one room, boiling in another, and it proves the system itself is just reacting to all the wrong signals. So how do you actually fix a system that is that wildly out of balance?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Right. And the instinct for a lot of policymakers is to just walk into a hospital and mandate a raw percentage cut. They want to say, get your rate down to 15% by the end of the quarter.
Which is a terrible idea.
Exactly. Trying to fix a complex human system with a blind quota is incredibly dangerous. And that brings us to the foundational pillar of this entire blueprint. You need a diagnostic tool before you can prescribe a cure.
Which is where we introduce the globally endorsed standard known as the Robson Ten-Group Classification System. Or, in clinical circles, it's usually just called the Robson classification.
Okay, so what does that actually look like on the ground?
What this system does is mandate that every single delivery in a facility is categorized into one of 10 distinct groups based on objective standardized criteria. So it looks at factors like, is the patient a first-time mother? Are there twins? Is the baby head down? Has the mother had a previous C-section? Was labor spontaneous or was it medically induced?
I have to pause here because if I'm a hospital administrator or like a clinical lead listening to this deep dive, I'm probably rolling my eyes right now.
Oh, for sure.
My first thought is going to be, is this just another passive reporting metric? Because my nursing staff is already exhausted, and adding more paperwork to categorize patients doesn't magically stop surgeries.
It's a completely understandable reaction. But the data strongly refutes the idea that this is just busy work. The Robson classification acts as the mandatory enabling infrastructure for targeted clinical audits.
Okay.
Think of it as a highly sophisticated targeting radar. When a hospital actually applies this lens to their specific population, they stop looking at a vague, overwhelming 30% or 40% total surgical rate.
Right, it stops being just a giant, scary number.
Exactly. Instead, they invariably discover what the blueprint calls the high-yield bullseye. They find that their elevated rates are being driven almost entirely by 3 specific categories: Group 1, Group 2, and Group 5.
Let's actually break those down so you know who we're talking about. So Group 1 comprises first-time mothers with a single baby, head down, at full term, who go into labor spontaneously.
Right.
And Group 2 is very similar, first-time mothers, but their labor is medically induced, or they have a scheduled C-section before labor even starts. And then group 5 is women who have already had a prior C-section.
And this is where the strategy becomes incredibly elegant. If a hospital concentrates its reform efforts on Group 1, they prevent that primary, very first surgery from ever occurring.
Which fundamentally alters the trajectory of a woman's entire reproductive life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, once you have that first uterine scar, the medical management of literally every subsequent pregnancy changes completely.
Absolutely. You are setting the stage for decades of care. And then by focusing on Group 5, the women who already have that scar, the hospital actively works to break the repeat cycle.
Because repeat C-sections are huge, right?
Oh, massive.
Right.
In some medical settings, repeat C-sections account for up to 95% of the surgeries within that specific group. It becomes an automatic default. So this classification system shows stakeholders exactly where to aim their limited resources for the absolute greatest population level impact.
Okay, so the radar tells us that first-time mothers in Group 1 are the primary drivers of these runaway rates. The obvious question then becomes, why? What is happening in that specific delivery room that pushes a low-risk first-time mother who went into labor spontaneously onto an operating table?
And this brings us to what might be the most fascinating revelation in the entire data set. We have to talk about the math of labor.
Yes, the math. I found this part wild.
It really is. We are looking at a massive paradigm shift in how we define dystocia, which is the clinical term for abnormally slow or obstructed labor. For decades, modern obstetrics has been governed by what we can only call legacy math, specifically the Friedman curve.
Your 1950s math.
Exactly. This was a standard developed way back in the 1950s. Friedman's math established that active labor begins at around 3 to 4 centimeters of cervical dilation. Crucially, it expected a rigid, linear progression from that point forward, exactly 1 centimeter of dilation per hour.
Let's actually visualize this for a second, because it's kind of crazy. If you were a laboring mother for the last half-century, your progress was being tracked on a physical piece of paper on a clipboard at the end of your bed called a partograph. And right there on the paper is a literal straight diagonal line pointing up.
A perfectly straight line.
It makes me think about how unreasonable that expectation is for human biology. It's like trying to navigate unpredictable, modern highway traffic using a hand-drawn map from 1955.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. You expect your journey to be a perfectly straight line moving at a constant, unyielding speed. But the moment you hit normal biological traffic, the clinical team panics. They look at the clock, they look at that 1950 straight line, and they declare a failure to progress. And that administrative failure leads directly to the operating room.
It is a profound mismatch between protocol and physiology. Biology simply does not operate in perfectly straight lines. The contemporary math, which is now established by major bodies like the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, ACOG, and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, it completely rewrites that old map.
What does the new map look like?
Well, the modern data prove that labor is actually exponential, not linear. Progression is naturally much slower in the early phases, and then it accelerates rapidly later on. Therefore, active labor doesn't officially begin until at least 6 centimeters of dilation.
That is a massive shift in the baseline. I mean, moving the starting line of the ticking clock from 3 centimeters all the way to 6 centimeters changes everything about how a hospital manages a patient's care.
It changes the entire definition of what is normal. In fact, contemporary physiological data shows that the median time it takes a first-time mother to dilate from 4 centimeters to 5 centimeters is actually 1.3 hours. And it can safely take up to over 6 hours without any negative outcome for the baby.
Over 6 hours.
Yeah. If a clinical team is still using the 1950s math of 1 centimeter per hour, they are actively diagnosing a medical abnormality and recommending major surgery for a woman whose body is progressing perfectly normally.
If you're wondering how much this reform costs a healthcare system, here is the best part. Implementing this new 6-centimeter threshold requires absolutely zero new physical infrastructure.
Nothing at all.
A hospital doesn't need to purchase a $1 million MRI machine or build a new surgical wing. They literally just have to change the mathematical definition printed on their chart.
And the impact of that zero-cost intervention is staggering. The evidence synthesis points out that adopting these contemporary ACOG standards is the single most powerful population-level protocol reform available in this space. The data shows an adjusted odds ratio of 0.70 for first-time mothers.
Let's translate that for a second. That mathematically means that just by updating the math we use to define normal, a hospital can prevent about 3 out of every 10 unnecessary primary surgeries, just by giving the body the time it actually needs.
Which leads to the next logical step. If we update the math to allow for a longer, slower early labor, we have to acknowledge that this requires immense stamina from the patient. What physical intervention actually supports a woman through that new extended curve?
Right, because you can't just walk into the room, tell a laboring mother, great news, we updated the math, you're going to be here for another 6 hours, and then leave her alone attached to a monitor.
No, definitely not.
And this brings us to the intervention that the blueprint identifies as having the highest certainty to resource ratio in all of obstetrics. In a highly clinical, heavily medicalized environment filled with surgical suites and advanced telemetry, the most statistically powerful physical tool we have is a dedicated human companion.
Continuous labor support. The evidence here is rock solid, drawn from massive meta-analyses encompassing over 15,000 women. Ensuring that a mother has one-to-one professional or trained layperson support, like a doula, throughout active labor, creates a massive 25% relative risk reduction for ending up with a cesarean section.
25%.
Gotcha.
That is a massive drop. But let's dig into the why of that. Why does having someone hold your hand and guide your breathing literally change the physical outcome of childbirth?
It comes down to basic endocrinology. Labor is driven by oxytocin, which causes the uterus to contract. But when a patient is left alone in a sterile, unfamiliar, highly medicalized room...
Surrounded by beeping monitors and machines.
Exactly. She naturally experiences fear and isolation. That psychological stress causes the body to release high levels of cortisol and adrenaline. And adrenaline is part of the fight-or-flight response, so it literally blocks the release of oxytocin.
Wait, really? It just shuts it down?
Yes. The body essentially senses danger and tries to stall the labor so you can run away. Having a dedicated, continuous support person keeps that anxiety down, keeps the adrenaline suppressed, and physically allows the body's natural hormones to do their job and progress the labor.
It is incredible how the emotional environment directly dictates the physiological mechanics. And to ensure the medical staff is aligned with that supportive environment, the blueprint heavily advocates for adopting the WHO Labor Care Guide.
Yes, the LCG.
This completely replaces those old legacy partographs, the 1950s clipboards, with a modern tool. It incorporates the new exponential math thresholds, but more importantly, it includes specific forced prompts for shared decision-making. Before a doctor can just order an intervention because a certain amount of time has passed, the guide forces the clinical team to pause, assess the modern math, and consult the mother.
It shifts the clinical culture from reacting to a clock to responding to the patient.
So we have a clear diagnostic radar, we have updated evidence-based math, and we know that continuous human support physically changes outcomes. If the clinical solutions are this clear, why do health agencies and hospital boards so often get it wrong? Because global rates are still climbing.
They frequently fail because policymakers are always looking for a shortcut. They try to bypass the hard work of deep cultural and clinical change with simple economic levers. And this takes us directly into what the blueprint accurately labels the danger zone.
Let's talk about the economics. Let's be real for a moment. A cesarean section costs a healthcare system significantly more often 1.5 to 2 times more than a vaginal birth.
It's major surgery.
Yeah, historically, in many systems, physicians and hospitals have been reimbursed at a higher rate for performing the surgery because it takes more resources. So a well-meaning policymaker looks at that financial disparity on a spreadsheet and thinks, I have the silver bullet. We will just implement a standalone financial fix.
We'll equalize the fee.
Exactly. We'll pay the doctor the exact same amount whether they do a C-section or a vaginal birth. Take away the financial incentive, and the surgery rate will drop. Problem solved.
It sounds perfectly logical from an administrative distance, but the evidence, specifically the Zaro 2026 data synthesis, demonstrates exactly why this fails catastrophically in the real world.
Catastrophically.
Yes. When you apply simple regulatory or financial tweaks without simultaneously providing the clinical accountability and structural support we just discussed, you don't just fail to lower the C-section rate, you actually introduce severe, unintended clinical harms.
Harms like what, exactly?
Specifically, the data shows an associated increased rate of postpartum hemorrhage, severe, potentially life-threatening bleeding after birth.
Wait, I need to understand the mechanism there.
Yeah.
Why would simply paying doctors the same flat fee lead to more mothers hemorrhaging?
Because if you just tweak the money without giving the clinical team the updated guidelines, the doula support, and the time they need, you create a chaotic, unsupported environment. A provider might suddenly feel pressure to rush a vaginal delivery to clear the room, or they might inappropriately attempt a highly complex operative vaginal delivery using forceps or a vacuum without the proper training or patience.
Just because the old financial incentive to move to a controlled surgery has been arbitrarily removed. That makes total sense. It's like telling a factory floor that they will no longer get paid overtime for fixing defective products at the end of the line. You're trying to incentivize them to build the products better from the start. But if you don't give them better tools or more time, the workers just rush the defective products out the door to meet their daily quota.
The defect rate didn't actually go down.
Right, you just shifted the danger directly to the consumer.
Yeah.
Or, to use another analogy, it's like trying to make a car safer by making the airbags cheaper without ever fixing the brakes. Standalone financial reform doesn't magically prevent unnecessary surgery. It just arbitrarily lowers the safety threshold for the care being provided.
Exactly. You cannot mandate safety through economics alone. Without addressing the underlying clinical culture, taking away the financial safety net just creates new, often more dangerous emergencies.
Which means we're back to human behavior. If money isn't the magic bullet, how do you actually force a massive entrenched hospital system to change its ways? You have to build a governance structure where the internal culture works for you rather than against you.
And that is undeniably the hardest part of the blueprint. There is a massive behavioral review of medical culture from Kingdon in 2018 that essentially concluded, culture eats clinical guidelines for breakfast.
Culture eats guidelines. I love that.
It's so true, though. You can print out the new exponential math, you can tape it to the wall of every single labor ward, but if the unseen pushing forces are too strong, nothing will actually change.
When you say pushing forces, you mean the systemic pressures driving doctors toward the operating room, like medical legal fear, the constant paralyzing terror of being sued if something goes wrong during a long, complicated vaginal birth,
Right.
or professional silos, where obstetricians and midwives operate in entirely different worlds and don't communicate.
Yes. Those pushing forces will always overpower a printed piece of paper. To counter them, a hospital must engineer structural pulling forces. The most consistent enabler of positive change found in the data is strong, multidisciplinary team collaboration.
But you can't just send out a memo telling doctors and midwives to collaborate nicely.
No, you have to engineer the governance to explicitly require it.
Which brings us to the true governance engine of this whole framework. The mandatory second opinion, or MSO.
This is a vital mechanism. The blueprint details that before any non-emergency primary C-section can be performed, a second senior clinician must review the case. Now, it is crucial to understand that this isn't about second-guessing a doctor or catching them doing something wrong. It is about structured peer accountability and shared liability.
Go ahead.
The WHO ran a massive trial testing this exact combination evidence-based guidelines paired with a mandatory second opinion across nearly 150,000 births. It produced a definitive, high-certainty reduction in unnecessary surgeries.
Because it addresses the behavioral psychology of the provider. If I'm a doctor at 3 in the morning and I'm exhausted and the labor is progressing slowly and I'm worried about a potential lawsuit, the easiest thing for me to do is just order the surgery to be safe. I hold all that burden alone.
Exactly.
But if a senior colleague is required to review it, suddenly the burden is shared. It creates an institutional pause. It forces the clinical team to stop and ask, wait, is she actually at 6 centimeters? Are we reacting to the 1950s math or the modern math? Has her doula tried repositioning her? It creates a psychological safety net for the doctor, which translates into physical safety for the patient.
It interrupts the cascade of interventions. And this structured teamwork becomes absolutely vital when we look at tackling the largest single contributor to the total C-section rate, the pathway for vaginal birth after cesarean, or VBAC.
Right. Earlier, we established that Group 5 women who have already had a prior C-section is a massive driver. Once you have that scar, the system essentially defaults you to surgery. The data shows that the baseline uptake for women even attempting a vaginal birth after a previous C-section is staggeringly low. It sits at just 13.18%.
So low.
The vast majority of women are simply scheduled for a repeat surgery.
But the blueprint outlines that this behavior is highly modifiable. When hospitals implement structured quality improvement interventions, which means providing proper, unbiased counseling early in the pregnancy, accurate risk stratification, and rigorous emergency protocols, you can dramatically shift those numbers.
Shift them by how much?
In facilities that utilize these structures, the uptake for attempting a vaginal birth jumps from 13% to over 42%, and of those women who are given the chance to try, the success rate is an incredibly high 84.35%.
But I imagine the immediate pushback from any hospital board is going to be about safety. The historical fear with laboring after a prior C-section is the risk of the old uterine scar rupturing under the stress of contractions.
And we must absolutely respect that risk. It is real. However, the safety equation presented in the comprehensive data is very clear. As long as a facility has adequate 24-hour surgical cover available in case of an emergency, attempting a vaginal birth is highly cost-effective and remarkably safe. The actual risk of uterine rupture during a trial of labor is just 0.47%.
That is less than half of 1%.
Exactly. Now, contrast that tiny percentage with the cumulative maternal mortality and severe morbidity risks of performing repeat multiple abdominal surgeries, cutting through the same scar tissue 3 or 4 times over a woman's lifetime. When you weigh the data objectively, building a well-managed supportive pathway for these women is not just an option, it is a medical imperative.
So let's zoom out and look at what this all means for you, the listener. The stakeholder blueprint we've explored today is a beautifully layered framework. It proves that you cannot just apply one isolated fix. At the foundational level, you need the system incentives, things like tort reform and public accountability, so doctors aren't practicing defensive medicine out of pure legal fear, and financial models that actually support comprehensive care.
Right, a foundation.
In the middle, you have to build the governance layer, the Robson data tracking to see where the problems are, and those mandatory second opinion protocols so the internal culture holds the line at 3 in the morning. And finally, sitting on top, you have the education and clinical layer ensuring continuous doula support and updating the hospital charts to reflect modern biological math.
You cannot expect the clinical tools to succeed if the foundational governance and incentive layers aren't actively supporting them. It requires a synchronized effort across all 3 levels. Which brings us to the 3 final definitive mandates for change derived directly from this massive synthesis of global evidence.
Let's hear them.
Number 1, measure it. Universally adopt the Robson classification. You simply cannot reduce what you refuse to audit. Number 2, support her. Implement continuous one-to-one labor support. It is the highest certainty physical intervention we possess. And number 3, shift the math. Adopt the 6-centimeter active labor threshold to prevent that primary surgical cascade from ever beginning.
It really synthesizes the ultimate thesis of all these sources. The goal here is not to aggressively withhold surgery from women who actually need it. Nobody wants to go back to that freezing room in the metaphor where life-saving access is denied. Safe reduction is achieved by engineering a system where unnecessary surgery is never clinically justified in the first place.
It requires an entire systemic overhaul, driven by physiological data rather than legacy habits and administrative convenience. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of medicine, it leaves us with a rather profound and perhaps unsettling question to ponder.
Oh.
Well, if mathematical definitions of human biology from the 1950s, like the Friedman curve, were allowed to artificially inflate major surgical rates for decades in obstetrics, mostly unquestioned by the establishment, what other standard medical protocols in entirely different fields are currently coasting on obsolete math, just waiting for someone to finally challenge the baseline?
That is a question that should keep every hospital administrator awake at night. Thanks for joining us on this Needs Dive. We'll see you next time.